Here we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, An Awakening, How COVID-19 is Shifting Our Views of Safety Culture and Leadership, presented by Cority. This is Alan Ferguson, Associate Editor at Safety and Health Magazine. I'll moderate today's presentation. First, we'd like to thank you all for joining us on behalf of the National Safety Council's employees are currently working away from the office. We hope that you, your loved ones, and all the people in your lives are remaining safe and healthy wherever they are. We'll start the presentation in a couple minutes, but first there are some housekeeping items. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or the magazine endorses those items. After today's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session with our speakers. To ask a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, type your question, and click the send button. Please feel free to ask your question at any time during this presentation. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but we might not get to every question. The good news is that any unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. After this presentation, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and I'll tell you more about that a little later. This webcast will be archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. Or you may also receive a link in a post-event email. With that, let's introduce our speakers. With us today are Baldry, Product Marketing Manager with Cority. Sean is responsible for Cority's safety and health solutions and has more than 15 years of experience in occupational safety and health in the construction, manufacturing, and mining industries. Also with us is Dr. Andrew Sharman, Managing Partner of the International Culture and Leadership Consulting Firm, RMS Switzerland. Andrew has a master's degree in international health and safety law, as well as industrial psychology and organizational behavior. He also has a doctoral degree in leadership and cultural transformation. During his safety career, covering more than 2 decades, Andrew has guided global leaders in their commitment to zero incidents and towards safety excellence across a wide range of industry sectors, including aviation, construction, power generation and supply, consumer goods, oil and gas, and manufacturing. His experience spans more than 130 countries across 5 continents. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation. Sean, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Alan, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you can join us today. I'm pretty excited for the conversation we're going to have, and really the idea for the conversation came a few weeks ago when I came across an article that was discussing how COVID-19 was and would continue to fundamentally change the way that we would engage in our workplaces, our jobs, with our colleagues, and with the organizations at large with which we work. And this got me thinking, how would this transformation impact how organizations would approach safety, workplace safety, but most importantly, safety culture in the months and years ahead? And quite honestly, since I couldn't find any articles on that topic, I decided to reach out to some experts in the field that would help give their perspectives on what COVID-19 means for safety culture, and leadership. And that's why I'm really excited to have Andrew join us today. And as Alan had mentioned in the intro, Andrew is not only leads a global EHS consultancy that specializes specifically in safety and leadership transformation, but he's also the president of the Institution for Occupational Safety Health based in the UK. So Andrew has access to some of the biggest companies and the best minds when it comes to safety culture, not to mention being an expert himself. So I'm really glad, Andrew, you could join us today.
Thanks, Sean. Great to be with you. Good afternoon to you and everyone listening.
So today, I thought we would explore some of these ideas around how COVID-19 is shifting our views of safety culture. I presented some of those ideas on the left side of the screen, but I'm not going to go through them in detail. We have a lot to cover, and I figure let's just dive in and see what kind of great discussion that we can have.
Sure.
So I'd like to start by exploring this idea of changing perspectives. So it's clear that COVID-19 has shifted views on workplace health and safety, both at an organizational and at an employee level. You know, for me, it's probably one of the first times where I feel that organizations are seeing a real tangible connection between their ability to manage safety and, you know, long-term business viability. And at the same time, we're also seeing a a new labor movement of sorts, right? Where workers demanding better workplace conditions, they're demanding a better voice or a bigger voice and more engagement in safety discussions and the way that safety decisions are made. And I guess for myself, I often wonder whether this is a temporary change or does this really represent that fundamental shift that many organizations and safety professionals are looking for when it comes to safety. So Andrew, you've been speaking with thousands of business leaders and EHS professionals over the last couple of months during the pandemic. How do you think COVID-19 is changing perspectives or has changed perspectives on the importance of safety and safety culture? And what are you hearing or seeing that makes you think that?
Well, you're right to say that COVID has changed the way that we think about safety and health at work. In fact, it's changed everything about the way we live, work, eat, breathe, shop, spend time socializing and on pastimes. The world that we knew at the end of last year doesn't exist anymore. The world that we are in now and the world that we're moving into over the next few months as we find ways through the pandemic and back to some sense of normality, whatever that phrase means for us, is a brave new world. As the data on the screen tells us, the views are mixed. Perspectives out there are absolutely divided. Whilst we see some level of consensus around the importance of wearing masks, there are still people that are not sure whether it's okay to shake hands or to give people high fives or to pat people on the back for a job well done. And these perspectives will continue to change over the next few months as we all continue to learn more and more about the pandemic, ways of staying safe, staying healthy, and thinking about work in context too.
Yeah, that's particularly interesting. And I think, you'd kind of mentioned that this idea of everybody shifting to try to understand and operate within this new normal. And I guess I'm interested to know your thoughts on, you're seeing many EHS professionals now are encouraged in some ways by the changes that they're seeing, that their senior leadership teams are putting more effort and more resources into safety. And you're really seeing that increase in organizational commitment, which is something great to see. But in your opinion, what do EHS professionals need to do right now to not to lose that focus from the senior management team and really ensure that that commitment and that momentum continues on even after, perhaps we get better control over COVID-19?
Right. I think that's the key question right now. And the answer is simple, Sean. Safety professionals right now, wherever they are, no matter which country, which industry sector, no matter which grade they have in their profession, no matter whether they're starting out or at the end of their career, they need to grab both hands and get it wrapped around this opportunity that has never before existed in the world of OSH. Right now, the entire planet, every organization, everywhere is gripped with this pandemic. Every organization therefore needs to know how to get through it safely and healthily without jeopardizing the lives of the workers and in turn that jeopardizing the lives and livelihood of the organization too. So I'm making it sound simple, but I'm using this metaphor of getting our hands around the challenge. What I've learned over the last few months is that many OSH practitioners around the world are focusing on coronavirus. And they're telling me that 90 to 100% of the work they're doing right now is around COVID mitigation. I think that means that they'll miss an opportunity. Right now, as OSH is brought front and center stage for organizations, and leaders of businesses are asking OSH practitioners for help and guidance and direction, now's the time that OSH leaders need to say, okay, but it's not just about COVID. Let's also talk about the other occupational ill health issues that we face in this organization, or the risk of disease whilst at work in this organization. The conversation now needs to start broadening out to make sure that when the pandemic subsides and stops becoming the thing that we're all talking about, those OSH leaders still have that center stage position. They still have that trust, confidence, and desire from operational leaders to want to engage with the OSH leaders. If OSH leaders don't do that right now and they stay talking only about COVID, whenever the new normal comes along, Sean, those OSH leaders will go back to the positions that they had previously. So it's important that they step up, really own this domain right now and lead their businesses forward out of this pandemic.
Yeah, Andrew, I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's a huge opportunity here, and there's a risk of being too myopic. Just one final point on this topic, because I'm really enjoying the discussion, is on that idea of what should leaders, OSH leaders, be focused on to really secure that frontline worker engagement, because I think there's a huge opportunity there, along with what you're saying of bringing those people that have an interest and certainly a stake in occupational health and safety, bringing them into the fold and making them champions and making them key stakeholders in that discussion and that advancement.
Sean, your questions are really brilliant and immensely challenging. You've gone from asking me about OSH leaders and organizational leaders now to OSH leaders interfacing with those workers on the shop floor. And I think that's an important cohort for OSH people to remember. So what should they be focusing on right now? OSH leaders right now should be focusing on clarifying, simplifying, ensuring that the messages that they have around OSH, whether it's connected to COVID or any other organizational risk, they really need to focus on simplifying and getting the message really, really clearly.
That's great. That's great advice, Andrew. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about success and failure, because it's one of those topics that I've been reading a lot about reframing how we look at success and failure. And I think COVID-19 presents a pretty interesting use case around that. So, I think we don't have to look very far, to find newspaper headlines that are sharply criticizing how different governments around the world are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in many cases, these stories often argue that governments have, quote, failed to prepare for or respond adequately to this challenge that we see in front of us. And in some cases, we see in response to that criticism that the governments are engaged in somewhat questionable practices, either suppressing data and not letting it come out to the public, or manipulating it in a way to reframe a failure into a success. And these arguments kind of leave me thinking, whether our aversion to failure is actually preventing us from improving, right? So I think it's a topic that's always been there, but I think for me, COVID's kind of brought it out to the forefront. So I really wanted to ask you of your thoughts on how does the way that we measure success and failure, how does that impact our ability to reduce risk? And does our desire to avoid failure at all costs really create a missed opportunity or a variety of missed opportunities that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, right. I can't help but smile at the language that you're using, that we're suppressing or misreporting data, reframing it into leading us to believe that we've created success. You could pretty much say that's how we've been thinking about safety in many parts of the world for many, many years. There's all sorts of allegations about misrepresenting or suppressing data. I have hundreds of stories through personal experience of organizations that tell me that this isn't a lost time or a reportable accident because, and they go on to justify their misclassification or miss or underreporting of this data so that they believe that they've got better results. In fact, safety has got to be one of the only things in an organization that's fascinated with the measurement of failure, and its most important target for many organizations is just trying to fail less. Because if we think about it, an injury or an accident or an occupational ill health at work is a failure of something. It's a failure of systems, of policies, of procedures, of leadership, of culture. You can choose what you want to point the finger at. That's not for me to do here, nor do I suggest it's a great way of creating a great safety culture. But trying to fail less by just having less and less of these failures is never going to be a motivational strategy for any organization. Because as human beings, none of us like to fail. We've all had experiences of failing because we're human. We make mistakes. And when someone tells us, you failed, try not to fail again, it doesn't really make us feel good. So I think what we need to do, the lesson that we must learn here, whether it's from the pandemic or from decades of work in safety around the world, we need to be thinking about measuring positives and the presence of positives in order to justify whether we are safe at work or not myopically looking at the measurement of negatives, of failures, and saying, well, let's just try to fail less. If you take this to the wider world, Sean, and you think about your favorite sport, whether it's American football or rugby or hockey or tennis or any sport ever. Can you imagine a manager or a coach going into a dressing room and saying to their team, all right, team, listen, I've got a strategy for tonight's really important match. Just try not to let the other side kick the ball in the net or over the posts. Just try not to lose. No player in their right mind would be motivated by that, and neither are our workers. We've got to reframe this somehow in a way that allows people to feel involved and recognized as humans, as people that do make mistakes, and to be able to learn from them when we do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, the point that you've made is very salient, Yvonne. Those opportunities where we fail, they're great opportunities to learn, but we have to, shift the measures and really figure out ways that we can potentially measure safety differently. And I think in your response, you had kind of touched on what I would consider to be incremental improvement. So this way of just working and slowly getting better, it's kind of within that plan, do, check, act cycle that a lot of organizations are focused on of continual improvement. I find that particularly interesting. And you've written, and I know that we've spoken extensively about this idea of organizations becoming 1% safer. What do you mean by that? And how does it relate to this idea of success and failure?
Well, I guess it's tied directly to that previous discussion there. I think safety for too long has been binary. We're either safe or we're unsafe. We either hit our target or we don't hit our target. I've been to too many sites around the world where they have that big sign that says X days since our last accident. And it creates a culture of fear where every worker is thinking, I don't want to be the one that resets that meter back to zero, that causes us to fail against our target, that causes us to lose our team bonus. You can fill in the rest of those lines yourselves. This binary way of thinking about safety versus unsafety doesn't really work at all. So the power of marginal gains, of incremental progress, of continuous improvement in old world speak, I think is a much better option, because it allows to understand that workplaces are filled and dominated by humans, as leaders, as workers, as everything in between. And what I've been working on over the last 4 months during my own coronavirus lockdown is this idea of getting the world to think about becoming 1% safer. Because in binary terms, the figures are huge and quite difficult to get our heads around. 2.78 million people every year lose their lives at work due to an injury, an accident, or work-related ill health. 2.78 million dead, and that's a huge number. Even if we break it down, it's challenging. It's 7,616 every day. Still a huge number to get our heads around. But if we think about it at its most elemental, it's 1 every 10 seconds. One fatal accident or case of work-related ill health causing a death every 10 seconds. Now, if we could make the world 1% safer, that would mean 28,000 people surviving instead of dying every year. Now, if we all worked to make our businesses 1% safer every day, the compounding effects of this are colossal. It's a 3,800% improvement over 12 months, or in simple terms, would be better by 40 times in a year from now if we start working towards 1% improvement every day. So the 1% Safer book, and indeed the movement and the foundation that sits around that, is exactly trying to do that. We've got 142 of the world's leading thinkers on OSH, on leadership, and on culture. Names that your listeners here on this webinar will recognize, people like Scott Geller, Sidney Dekker, Eric Holnagel, Andrew Hopkins, many, many more. Plus also superheroes of the business scene, people like Edgar Schein, 94 years of age and still contributing magnificently to the world of organizational culture. Marshall Goldsmith, the world's #1 executive coach and 2-time Thinkers 50 Hall of Famer. So we've got all these people putting one chapter together into this book called 1% Safer. And I think it's quite an exciting proposition that OSH practitioners can get a copy of this and get 137 individual chapters, each distilling one idea that these global thought leaders believe will make their organizations 1% safer.
That's great. I'm very interested to read it. It'll be on my reading list. So I'd like to shift slightly and talk about behavior, because I know this is something near and dear to your heart. And I read an interesting article recently on Wired.com that was talking about the mask shaming phenomenon. And I'm sure you've heard this or even seen it. But with governments and public health agencies, mandating a mask to be used in public areas and in institutions, we're seeing this very polarizing debate on whether it should be used or worn, or the idea between community safety versus individual rights and things of that nature. And what was most interesting I found about the article was it talked a lot about this idea of public shaming. That it was increasingly being used by individuals on both sides of the debate, but the data was showing it wasn't really effective at changing individual behaviors or perspectives or attitudes with respect to masks. So the question I had for you was, because workplace or behavior has such a focal point in a workplace safety context, I wanted to get your thoughts on what does the mask debate really reveal to us about the nature of behavioral change and the role of leadership in driving that change?
I think it reveals two things, Sean. The first is that people generally don't like being told what to do. None of us really like rules or being instructed to do things. All of us like being involved in discussion and understanding and gaining clarity. So many of us, in fact, the majority of us, particularly as the data shows in Singapore, Japan, France, and the US, many of us comply with the rules because they understand why those rules are there. But others don't comply simply because they don't like complying with rules. They choose to be their own person. Now, what's the biggest behavioral change that we know in OSH over the last few decades? Well, we know that the power of culture is important. We know that leaders demonstrating, role modeling, walking the talk is a way to help others realize that that's the behavior that they're looking for. Allied to that is that power of feeling like we're in the in crowd, that we are like everybody else. We're part of that group, part of that club, part of that tribe. So what leaders need to do here, I think, is to distill down into most simple terms why wearing masks is so important, why the leader chooses to wear a mask, and why it's important for the leader in the organization that everybody else wears masks, and to perhaps show a little bit of perhaps vulnerability, Sean. I don't like wearing a mask. Right now here in Switzerland, where I live, temperatures are super hot in the mid to late 30s in Celsius, which I think is late 90s, and even over 100 in some days over here in Fahrenheit. So wearing a mask is a bit uncomfortable. When I've got my glasses on and my mask on, it steams up. So I want to take my mask off. But out of a sense of civic duty, I keep it on because that's my human nature. And I notice most people around here are doing the same. So I think these are the sorts of things that we need to tap into and to try to take mask wearing away from being you must do this, it's the rule. So here's why it's so important that we all do this together.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think one of the things that I've learned, from my experience in occupational health and safety roles, but it really kind of emphasized in the mask debate, is this idea of certainly expressing the importance in modeling the behavior as a leader that we want to see. But I'd really be, interested in your thoughts on this idea of also, injecting yourself into the work that individual does to perhaps understand what are some of the very tangible barriers that prevent that behavior. So as an example, years ago, working in construction, we would mandate people to wear eyewear when they were shoveling, right? Manual shoveling tasks, because we're worried about dust getting into people's eyes. And what we had found was, as you described, wearing eyewear, depending on where you are, the humidity would cause it to fog up. I wouldn't know that unless I was walking around talking and really becoming interested in what people were doing. So how do you think that factors in terms of a leadership approach in kind of pushing people toward the behaviors that we want to see?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Sean. It's too easy, isn't it, for us, whoever we are, to set diktats that people must do stuff without fully understanding what that person's life at work is like. So I think the engineer in me, engineering was my first career, encourages me to roll up my sleeves and get in and do jobs alongside people at the sharp end of work to see what it's like. Because once we start to understand what someone's job's like, it makes us much more trustworthy when it comes to talking about OSH risks or wearing of PPE, personal preventive equipment. And I think we've also got to remember at this point, Sean, that whilst the focus here in this discussion is on masks right now, PPE, personal preventive equipment, is the lowest level of the hierarchy of control measures. So it's meant to be the last resort. We should be finding other solutions first to reduce the risk before we turn to masks.
I would totally agree with you on that point. Good final period to end that piece of a discussion. So let's change tack a little bit and let's talk about wellness. You know, there's rather unanimous agreement that the pandemic has kind of brought mental health and wellness to the forefront. We're seeing people placed under considerable strain, and that's having an effect on individual resilience, but also resulting in higher rates of stress, anxiety, depression, substance use. So, you know, and what I found interesting is that stress doesn't necessarily diminish when people go back to work. On the right side of the screen, this was a figure that came from a recent Gallup poll that showed that 65% of US workers were feeling safe at work. Now, that, depending on where you are and in relative terms, that might not seem that bad, but it's the lowest score that poll has garnered in the last 10 years. So workers, particularly here in the US, are certainly feeling less safe when they're at the workplace. So, and a lot of that has to do with wellness. So, you know, from your vantage point, Andrew, in discussions with leaders, how has the pandemic changed organizational perspectives on wellness? And what effect do you think that'll have on the way that we manage wellness going forward in our businesses?
I think you've got some useful data on the screen here, and I'm actually quite surprised that it's quite low. The data on the left there is showing between 10% to 33% of people saying they experience stress, anxiety, or sadness during the pandemic. Over the last 5 months, I've been speaking to IOSH members, the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health. It's the world's biggest body for OSH professionals. We've got about 48,000 members in 130 countries. I've been speaking to them remotely over Zoom and tech like this. And in each one of these sessions, we've run a quick pulse survey, asking them, do they feel more or less anxious or stressed as a result of the pandemic? And we're getting an aggregate over about 3,000 to 4,000 people now who have taken part in this pulse survey, all OSH practitioners. We're getting an aggregate of around 75% saying they feel more anxious and more stressed as a result of the pandemic. So whilst the statistics data that we see on the screen may be generic for populations at large, I think there's a real issue for OSH professionals right now as they are being brought in for more discussions with leaders, as they are being depended on more. There's a lot of weight on the shoulders of OSH professionals. So I think we need to bear in mind that as we think about this picture. But more broadly, of course, we are seeing that there's a bigger interest in the health and well-being of workers as a result of the pandemic. And as I said earlier, I think we need to try to broaden that out so that organizations realize at this important moment that it's not just about a coronavirus. It's about broader mental health issues, anxiety, stress, depression, and I predict post-pandemic, we're going to see a huge rise in the number of PTSD cases, post-traumatic stress disorder cases, as people deal with the fallout of pandemic and what it means for them.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that point. I think, you know, if you go back and you look at the data, even pre-pandemic, there was, you know, considerable signs that said that, you know, we need to put, you know, much more emphasis from an individual and an organizational perspective on wellness. You know, we were in the billions, if not trillions, of lost GDP that was associated with depression and mental illness. So certainly that was there. I think COVID has certainly presented the conditions that allowed it to become more visible. But yeah, organizations need to be thinking about how they're going to manage through the current condition, but also how they're going to create a foundation by which they're going to be able to manage these issues going forward. So with that being said, what health and well-being issues specifically do you think organizations should be working on right now, but perhaps aren't?
Well, I think the ones that we've hinted at, anxiety and stress, these kind of potentially these lower grade feelings of anxiety, the kind of grating away at us, the feelings of, am I still going to have a job in a few months' time? Am I going to get coronavirus from someone when I go back to work? These sorts of lower grade anxieties can really wear away at us. And I talk about this firsthand. As the pandemic took hold and started to change the way that my business, RMS, handled and supported its clients around the world, I started to become very anxious about what the future would look like too. So I think this anxiety is shared by everybody. Leaders need to be thinking about how they disperse some of that. And I think the answers are by showing leadership humility and humanity. So showing that leaders are real people. And I think technology like Zoom that we're using tonight does that really well. We get to see leaders in their home environment, in their natural habitat. And that might include their cat walking across the front of their desk, or the dog barking in the background, or the kids coming asking mommy or daddy for some food or to play. And I think this has really kind of broken down some of the barriers between leaders and workers. And I think that's very important. But more than that, there are deeper issues that can have more significant impact. Working in disrupted locations from a place that's not a normal workplace, or in isolation where individual people living alone are now finding that the way that they socialized predominantly through work is now not happening. And they're being asked to stay in their homes. And that may be particularly challenging for some people. And then, of course, there are those that do have people around them at home, with families, with kids, with pets, with other responsibilities and duties. And now they're trying to find ways to manage all of that stuff and the challenges that are going on in their lives whilst working too. So I think these are the broader issues: disruption, isolation, low-grade fears and anxieties, plus those higher grade issues of, am I going to lose my job? Am I going to be able to pay my mortgage? Am I going to be able to pay for my groceries? These big issues need to be dealt with. And I think the answer comes down to a sense of humility amongst leaders, showing that they're real human beings, becoming more authentic, showing their own vulnerabilities. And perhaps the simplest way to do that is just to share personal experience and to let workers know that it's hard for us as leaders as it is hard for them as workers.
That's a great point, and it actually segues quite well with the next point, or the next idea that I wanted to express to you, and I'm not sure if you've answered it already, but we'll give it a crack. But I think it's been pretty well known that when we focus on leadership and we talk about countries that have really done well during the present pandemic, New Zealand's COVID-19 response always seems to come to the forefront, and much of the success that they've had, I think a lot of people would attribute to the leadership of their Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. And to your point, one of the things that seems to come out quite clearly is that she comes across as a very authentic, a very empathetic and compassionate communicator. So somebody that's willing to give the straight goods, but does it in a way that's real and compassionate, and it feels authentic to people. And I think people can gravitate to that. So without restricting our discussion on particularly on Ms. Ardern, what do you think the crisis is revealing more broadly about the nature of leadership, and what are some of those learnings that leaders should be mindful of as they go forward?
I think over the last couple of decades, we've seen a lot of heroic leaders in the sense that leaders like to feel big, important, in power, in control, to have the right answers, to always be doing the right thing and be seen to be doing the right thing. I think the days of heroic leadership are over. I think the pandemic has underlined for every leader everywhere that they're only human. And that they can catch coronavirus like any of their workers, that they will be as sick as anybody else, that they are potentially exposed to this increased risk. So I think the pandemic is becoming a bit of a great leveler for many organizations and societies. I think Jacinda Ardern does something quite interesting as a leader. She demonstrates not just the vision of where she wants to go, but she does it in a way where she's serving others rather than herself. And she continues to put New Zealand's people at the heart of everything she does and the heart of everything she says. And I think that's what we need to do as us leaders, And as business leaders too, we need to put people at the heart of safety and health and of our organizations, because they ultimately are the secret to the success of every business. So we've got to focus here on people. And we do that by following leads like Jacinda's giving us here. She's deliberately choosing language, compassionate, strong. She's saying you can do both. I think it's the same in safety. We can prevent accidents, but we can also create safety. We can look at inputs and outputs together rather than in isolation. And I think that's a strong message that we get here from the Prime Minister of New Zealand.
You know, it's pretty interesting that you mentioned the term language, because I recall a previous discussion that you and I had. We were talking about the power that language has, whether it be, you know, influencing a particular attitude or particular behavior, or the culture in general. And what's interesting is how powerful language can be, but how it's often, I don't want to say misused, but it's often not considered as strongly or as acutely as perhaps it should. Can you just speak to us a little bit about your thoughts around language and some of the things that we should, as leaders and each as professionals, be mindful of in the way that we talk and trying to emphasize the things that we think are important?
Yeah, this language thing is of real interest to me. And I've learned this the hard way. 25 years ago, when I started out in occupational safety and health, I'm sure I was a bit of a pain in the backside to the people I was working with. I knew every regulation off by heart. I could quote verbatim the regulatory requirements. And my language was all around protection and prevention and mitigation and harm and zero accidents. And it can't have been particularly inspiring. In fact, I've got to tell you, I really enjoy my job nowadays much more than I ever did back in those days when I was thinking safety was all about compliance. Yes, there's an important role for compliance and assurance and governance. It's essential to have that framework. But what I've learned in my career is that culture trumps compliance every time. In fact, culture trumps strategy, and all of those other lines that we can think about culture eating strategy for breakfast. And culture is created in part, as Edgar Schein says, by the language that we use. So I think we've got to get ourselves away from language like protection and prevention and mitigation and into some of the language that we've learned to think about through the pandemic. And in recent years, the more forward-facing OSH practitioners have been too, thinking about authenticity, about empowerment, enablement, encouragement, engagement, teamwork, motivation, talking about OSH risks in language that makes sense, is comprehensible to everybody that we work with, rather than the language of jargon and technology.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you on that point, Andrew. I think, again, and I find, you know, your anecdote about how you would approach the health and safety profession as a green hand versus somebody a little bit more experienced. I see myself in your story about, you know, being very compliance driven and what we learn, and being a little bit more focused on people is certainly something that everybody can certainly take away. I guess as a final point on this topic, I just wanted to ask you, if there was one skill, one competency that you think an EHS leader should be focusing on, it would be the appropriate time to focus on it in kind of the present context, what do you think that would be?
I think my answer would be just one word. It would be listening. I think OSH practitioners and leaders everywhere need to focus more on listening. And it sounds very easy, but we're not very good at it as human beings. We're good at hearing, but not good at really, truly listening. And to be able to truly listen, we need to ask really good questions. For a long time, the OSH profession has been dominated by questions like, is everything safe? Or have you got any safety issues? These questions don't actually change performance or culture. So I think we've got to ask meaningful questions to people in our organizations and get leaders doing the same. And then really sticking around and listening carefully to what the answer is and probing a little bit more and listening again until we really have the information that we need.
That's great advice. And that kind of takes us to our last topic, and obviously one of the ones that I find most interesting because it's you know, aligned with what I do every single day. But this last topic is about technology, and you know, it's clear that the country lockdowns really forced organizations to adapt, their workplaces, their processes rather quickly to be able to maintain their business operations over the past few months. And, we've seen technology play a huge role in organizations being able to return to the workplace and being able to support those return to work efforts, whether that be through temperature screenings or in-app health screening checks, or through visitor management by having to log in and really try to get an understanding of who's at our workplaces, or everyone's favorite, the online Zoom video conferencing. So, with that being said, there's a lot of analysts that are arguing that COVID-19 will permanently alter the workplace. We're going to see more people working remotely. We're going to see physical workplaces changing, and that is going to place technology front and center in that transformation. So I'm, as somebody that's been using technology extensively to stay connected with businesses and with your membership through IOSH, I'm interested in what do you think? How do you think technology is going to change the way that, business leaders are going to manage safety, are going to promote safety culture, and really going to advance, our workplaces where they need to be, in this post-pandemic world?
Yeah, look, I think tech is changing the way we live and work every single day before the pandemic, and definitely it's accelerated it through the pandemic. Just kind of setting a little bit of context around your question here, Sean. I'm chairman of the board of the Institute of Leadership and Management, which looks at the latest trends for leaders and managers and supporting their own development journeys. And some research that we just completed shows that only 1 in 3 people expect to return to their workplace post-pandemic. That 50% of people think home working is here to stay. And quite intriguingly, 25% of the managers and leaders surveyed believe that they'll move organizations after the pandemic. Now, these 3 data points in their own right are starting to point towards the change that we're seeing and going to continue to see. The virtual world of work, whether it's on our mobile devices, on our laptops and tech like the one that we're using tonight on Zoom, or on team calls or conference calls, as we will remember them from over the last few years too. This is the way that we will work from now on. And I think what the pandemic might do is prove to organizations that people don't need to be in a particular place in order to do some work. Now, I don't mean everybody. Of course, there will still be a need for workers to be on shop floors and construction sites and using their hands and their brains in a particular place at one time. But all of our major clients around the world, Fortune 500 corporations predominantly, are saying, we just have too much office space now. We don't need people to do that anymore because they work just as well at home. And in fact, they seem to feel better when they're working at home too. So I think this switch towards virtual working is one that's important. And we're seeing it in our business. We've moved 90% of our workload from face-to-face coaching and workshops to now 90% online coaching and workshops. And we've seen a real surge in interest in our IOSH qualification courses in behavioral safety leadership and in workplace wellbeing leadership, both being completed entirely online at the learner's own pace. And now I've mentioned those, I should say that we have an exclusive for this webinar for everybody here to get 15% off those programs with the code Cority exclusive. And we can post some details on that offer later perhaps. But I think this shift to tech is one that OSH practitioners need to get up to speed with. For a while, we've seen organizations like Cority dominating the space with service offerings that make OSH practitioners' lives easier. And I think we're going to see more and more and more of that. And when I look at the work that you guys do there in Cority, I see this pace of change happening. So it feels like quite an exciting time to be involved in OSH.
Yeah, it definitely is, and I would agree with you. I think certainly on a training perspective, it's one of the things that when I talk to our clients or some of the EHS leaders in the field, it's those practical challenges that they're thinking about. It's I'm used to training, bringing in a group of workers into a conference room or into a lunchroom or a trailer, and to provide a toolbox talk or a face-to-face facilitated kind of training session. And that is not impossible, but it certainly presents its challenges in trying to maintain social distancing at the same time. So I do think that you're going to see this transformation, as you'd said, to a lot more interest in those, self-paced, self-managed, micro-learning type of applications. You know, obviously, if you've been one of the few, as I have, that have worked extensively from home, and perhaps when the lockdown started, you didn't really have your home office. You were working in some very kind of curious and interesting setups, and that's kind of thrust ergonomics to the forefront as well. So we're going to see you know, a lot of those opportunities, and I think finally, you know, for me and over the past couple of months, we've been working quite extensively with a lot of clients that, you know, around data, specifically because you know they were relying on manual processes, and now we suddenly had to pull information together to give it to a public health agency to say, this is the number of cases I have, this is what I'm doing to manage compliance to social distancing restrictions, this is what I'm doing to try to get an understanding of who's been tested, and that becomes very difficult, you know, when you're using manual processes. So it's an interesting time. You know, we'll have to wait and see what it comes, but I think technology will come to the forefront. And I think just to kind of, as a final question to end our conversation before we flip it to audience questions, you know, you had mentioned the shift to a virtual kind of workplace. How do you think safety culture is going to change in a virtual workplace versus a workplace that we're normally accustomed to? I'm always interested in that.
That's a massive question, Sean. You know, I was just thinking about another personal experience. And during the lockdown, or in fact, before the lockdown started, at the end of February, early March, I went back home to Scotland, where I'm from, to visit my family for a few days. And I ended up getting caught there as the pandemic kicked in and restrictions on travel occurred across Europe. I ended up spending 3.5 months in an Airbnb rental property with just a weekend bag of clothes. And as I saw my organization and my delivery of service offerings through our team completely shift from face-to-face to being postponed to coming back as a virtual activity, I really started to see firsthand what this was really like. I was working every day on a small laptop screen instead of my big monitors, and being out with clients and teams. And I found that quite challenging. I developed a sore back and a bit of a pain from sitting down on my butt all day. So I think we don't really know what the future is going to look like. And this can be both exciting and scary at the same time. My suggestion is we need to find a way to kind of balance ourselves. We don't need all of the answers to all of the questions right now. We could try repositioning and reframing this as an exciting time to be an OSH professional, as we get to learn new risks and try to work out how to control and to mitigate those risks in an appropriate way. So I guess I just kind of offer that as a contextual tip, perhaps. So yeah, I think that the future's bright. It's filled with tech. It is challenging. How do we create a culture of safety over tech? Well, I think that's a good question. It probably goes back to some of those fundamental leadership behaviors around authenticity, vulnerability, humility, and asking great questions so that people feel like they're connected. As people, we work for people. As people, we like people. As people, we want to be with people. So I think for me, the pandemic and the ways of creating culture through the pandemic, it's all about connection and allowing people to feel like they're part of something.
Great final point, Andrew. Thanks.
Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of our conversation. I just wanted to alert any of the listeners today that we do have some additional learning resources available through RMS Switzerland. And I'll just, Andrew, I'm not sure if you want to give a 30-second review of what we have to offer for those that are interested to learn more about the topics that we discussed today.
Yeah, right. So there's 2 online programs, Sean. Thank you for mentioning them. The first one is the Certificate in Behavioral Safety Leadership. It focuses on, as the name suggests, the way leaders can influence the behaviors of workers and others around the safety agenda. And the second one is essentially the same sort of objective. It's how leaders can activate a culture of well-being in their organization, and learning the skills and tools that you need to be able to drive a culture of wellness, health, and well-being. Both of them are entirely online, both completed in 4 to 6 hours. Pause your progress and return to it as often as you like. Lifetime access to the materials and 15% off with that code Cority exclusive if you click on that link that we've given you there.
Great, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
So thanks everyone for listening. That brings us to the end of our formal presentation. I'm going to hand the presentation back over to Alan to take any audience questions that might exist.
Well, thank you so much. We want for this fantastic and insightful presentation. And before we start the Q&A, I want to remind everyone about the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar, and your input is very important because it'll help us improve our future webcast. Okay, now let's get to some questions, of which there are quite a few. So the first one is, my company was on the verge of a relaunch of our launch of an overall health and wellness program for our employees before the pandemic. That launch was put on the back burner when we had to deal with all of the pandemic issues and challenges. Post-pandemic, how would you approach such a launch without using the pandemic as a crutch issue? Or would you embrace the pandemic as the perfect example of why this program is needed?
Hey, what a great question. Mike Rixner, thanks for your question. I like that. Look, I think there's no issue with using the pandemic as a crutch, in your words there. I think you've managed to open a dialogue with leaders in your organization around health and wellness pre-pandemic. Well done. That in itself is a great achievement. You've managed to continue a dialogue on health and wellness, perhaps dominated by coronavirus. There's no worry at all for me in linking those two things together and saying thank you to your leaders. Thank you for placing the health and wellness of our workers at such an important moment in the organization's development. Now, as we get confidence around how we handle coronavirus, let's make sure that we use all of these learnings and continue on with a health and wellness program. It sounds like you're creating some real success there, Mike. Well done.
So for our next question, how can we take advantage of the mandatory COVID PPE requirements and transfer it to affect behavior or perceptions of other PPE requirements?
How can we take it? I'm just reading this, Alan, as well. Yeah, look, I think what we have here is an opportunity where people are wearing a piece of PPE that they may not normally usually wear, a face mask. I think we're also seeing that people are encouraged to find social distance between other people. So we've got these two new requirements on people that are different behaviors for most. I think it's important to perhaps use these in discussions. If you want to create a different discussion around PPE, perhaps starting with the requirement to wear face masks is a good one. And, you know, I've admitted in this call that I find them to be quite uncomfortable. I've tried several different kinds of face masks to try to find one that works for me, that I feel comfortable in and doesn't steam my glasses up or cause my face to itch. I think Sean Baldry also gave a really useful piece of advice that we need to get into someone else's shoes and see what it's like for them to be wearing different types of PPE. So perhaps this is through discussion. This is about asking questions to people about what PPE do they need to wear for their job? Why is that PPE important? And how does the PPE that they currently use, how does that feel? How does it work? How effective is it? What would the worker want to change about the PPE requirements that they have in their organization?
And I'll just add one more thing to what Andrew was saying. Andrew had mentioned earlier in the presentation, and I wholeheartedly agree, that we have to consider PPE for what it is, right? It's the lowest level of the hierarchy of controls, and often we tend to go there because it's simple, because it's efficient, and because we can, it's cost effective, essentially. Let's be honest, right? It's easier to buy a mask and give it to an individual than to have to look at an engineered system that would remove particulate from a workplace, you know, that somebody would be exposed to. I think, you know, going and again, understanding the constraints that people work under and how uncomfortable or how how PPE could affect the way that they do their work, I think that degree of empathy and that understanding is going to lead a lot. It's going to be able to bring people together to get a very clear understanding of what we're dealing with. And then we can, it's this idea of ideation where we can look at all the different perspectives, all the different options, and kind of rule them out before we jump to PPE. I think one of the things that PPE is that we found through PPE is it's not foolproof. We've seen that through COVID, and I think that's hopefully opening some eyes on how we use PPE generally within our workplaces.
Right.
We've had a couple of questions along this same line. With more people working from home, some people are perhaps getting injured at home. When it comes to investigations of the mishap or incident, and obviously you're not allowed to go into an employee's home necessarily, so how do you address that situation? Or how do you ease management fears about employee safety while working from home?
Mm-hmm. So Teresa asks a great question here. And I think the reality is, as she suggests, that it is impossible for us to get inside and risk assess everything about people's homes. So here, we're going to be tested on the strength of trust, the bond between leaders and workers who are working in a place that's their home or not the usual workplace. This is about transparency of communication. It's about trust and engagement. It's about creating the kind of culture where a worker can speak up and say, hey, you know what? I actually don't have a suitable chair to sit in for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day whilst I work on my computer. I don't have an appropriate stand or mouse to use whilst I'm using my IT. And for the leader to embrace that and say, okay, so what do we need to do? How do we find a way to make that right? To remind teams of the importance of getting up and taking a stretch, of drinking lots of water while we're sitting in front of warm screens, of getting out and taking a break and refocusing our eyes on other things. There are some very simple things that leaders can be doing here in engaging with their teams. And I think those are key. Sean, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with what you were saying, Andrew. I would say, to add to that, I would say, we had mentioned earlier that, a lot of, with kind of this new perspective, there's, workers want to have a seat at the table in kind of deciding their work environment, even if that's a home work environment. And I think in a lot of cases, the speed in which people were kind of thrust into working from home, they either didn't have the resources, didn't have the time, or really the perspective to look at where they were working and try to consider how do we make that properly adjusted, properly suited to what I'm doing. And it's 3-4 months down the road when you start to have the aches and pains that you start to notice that something's not right. So I think we can certainly leverage interfaces like we have with Zoom calls to still have those meetings, still have those cooperative discussions where we can present a particular problem to a group of colleagues to try to come up with ideas and really share best practices. You might be dealing with one issue at a homework environment that someone else isn't, right? So again, we're shifting from this question about trying to address the legality of investigating incidents after the fact, and let's bring it forward, right? Let's start assessing the risk and really looking at simple controls. There's simple things that you can do with a home office environment by, I started out propping my monitors on books that I had available because I didn't have the appropriate stand. Whatever you can to make it happen, that's the environment that we're working in. But I think that there's still a lot of opportunity there, but it's a matter of shifting the focus back to assessing risk proactively. And that doesn't change whether we're at home or at a formal workplace.
It looks like we have time for one more question. How do you face the challenge of social distancing with kind of the human nature of wanting just to have simple conversations, e.g., how was your weekend? Did you see the game last night? Those sort of things.
Yeah. This is Todd Monroe here. Well done, Todd. What a good question. Human nature does want to make us have simple conversations. We thrive on knowing if our friends saw the game or what their plans are for the weekend or whether they're going to the barbecue or what their latest super spice or rub is that they're going to use. It's hard, isn't it? I think one of the things that we need to do, and in fact, I suggest this as a challenge or maybe even an obligation to those on this call, is that we need to connect this back a little bit to the earlier point I was making about language. I think social distancing is absolutely a misnomer. Our governments want us to be physically distant between each other. They want a meter or a meter and a half or 2 meters, whatever it is in feet. Forgive me for not knowing exactly. They want a physical distance between people to reduce the risk of transmission. Now, social distance, I think social distance has decreased. I think human connection has grown. We've found ways to communicate with each other. We've all got into and embraced virtual technology like this, using webinars or Zoom or GoToMeetings or Teams. We've all learned how to make little WhatsApp chat groups on our phones. Some of us have started on Yammer and things like that too. Some of us, the old school like me, have started writing little postcards and notes to people that I haven't been in touch with for a while and want to let them know that they're important to me. So I think none of those questions about what are you putting on the barbecue, or did you see the game, or hey, what's going on? None of those questions are off the radar. We just now need to find ways of asking them in a way that means we might need to step a little bit further away from people, or we might need to find different ways of communicating and asking those questions. But the important thing here, Todd Monroe, is that we continue doing it. We continue asking those questions, allowing people to feel connected, and importantly, allowing ourselves to feel connected too.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but any unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. Again, we also hope you take the time to share your feedback through our survey. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank Sean Baldry, Dr. Andrew Sharman, our sponsor, Cority, and of course, everyone who joined us today. Take care and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.